I think it's safe to get started. This session, the presenter is going to be Matthew Hall. The session is using Duo for two-factor authentication of admin accounts at UVA. Matthew is the technical lead for the University of Virginia's Scholarly Technology Group. He manages the software development and system administration team for UVA Collab, their implementation of the Sakai LMS. His focus is on the tools, services, and integration that make up UVA's central online collaboration and learning environment. So Matthew, you go ahead and get started with your presentation.
All right, thanks, Derek. Can everyone see the presentation slides and hear me okay before we get started? Derek, you can just respond.
I can see your screen.
Okay, awesome. All right, so hi everyone, I'm Matthew Hall, and today we're going to be talking about how UVA has implemented two-factor authentication to protect administrative level accounts in Sakai. So we have a nice small group here, and I will kind of go through this, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. Just to kind of start off, I suspect everyone is pretty familiar with this, but just the concept of two-factor authentication being at least two of the three primary ways that we can identify ourselves online, something you know, i.e. our password, which right now is the only protection for Sakai admin accounts by default out of the box. Something you have, for example, your mobile phone, or something you are, i.e. biometrics. Common second factor implementations can take a lot of forms. Sometimes you'll get an SMS message to your cell phone. A lot of sites implement it that way. The old school method was actual hardware tokens that have a screen on them with some kind of passcode that changes with the time that you have to type in. And the objective here is to reduce the dependence on a simple password by adding a second factor to make the account a lot harder to hack into. And obviously this is something that you need to balance the security with the ease of use for the end users. I'm sure everyone uses their administrative level accounts in Sakai pretty frequently for support and maintenance of the system. And so obviously something that's really secure but very difficult to use is going to be a problem. So the approach that we've taken balances these well, but it's worth starting by looking kind of at the threat model and what we are protecting against to keep in mind when you're looking at this security versus ease of use balance. So it's worth noting that Sakai administrative accounts are very high value credentials. Once you're logged in as an administrator, you can access any site, you can look at whatever grades or anything that's been posted in any site, you can impersonate users and take actions on behalf of them. So this is really a high target credential. And as universities come under increasing attack, there's a lot of push in the security community, certainly at our university and others, to really tighten down all of the administrative level access to systems that house sensitive data. And so in the interest of getting out ahead of that, that's really what drove our approach to looking at two-factor authentication. Administrative level accounts are typically implemented as local Sakai accounts. Like a lot of universities at UVA, we use a user directory service to tie in with our central student database to allow everyone to use single sign-on. But for administrators, we're using the built-in Sakai account credentials, which really have little out-of-the-box protection. You just have a username and password, and that's all you need out of the box to get in. We use our administrative credentials to log in interactively using the X login sort of Sakai login form, as well as using it in scripts and through the API where you'll generate a session and then need to run automated processes against a lot of sites, obviously requiring administrative level permissions. So the solution to this security problem needs to take into account both interactive logins and the possibility that you're doing something more in a command line script kind of environment. And out of the box with a simple password only protection scheme, This is something that could easily be a phishing target. Send somebody who you know isn't an LMS administrator an email, and maybe you'll get lucky and they'll click on it and type in their credentials. We used passwords issues or even brute force. So those are really the threats that we're looking at here and what we're trying to protect against with this two-factor authentication project. So our solution at UVA is to require two-factor authentication for all Sakai local accounts with administrative permissions. That is, when the login process is initiated after validating the username and password, we check the permissions associated with that account. And if they are an administrator or super admin in sort of the Sakai backend terminology, then we require additional authentication. Normal local user accounts, i.e. guest accounts, people who have been added via their email address and aren't otherwise logging in via our central single sign-on approach, are passed right through if they don't have administrative permissions. We've chosen to use Duo Security's hosted service, and this is a really flexible platform that allows users to use their own cell phone, a landline, a hardware token. They can receive text via SMS. Basically, all of the main two-factor authentication methods you can think of are supported and handled by Duo Security's service, and they provide a really nice, simple API for us to work with. It also offloads the security sensitive aspects of handling the second factor authentication to Duo, whose entire business is doing this, and prevents all of that logic from needing to be built into Sakai. The actual checking of the second factor credentials, sending a message, validating the code you get back is heavyweight and certainly a very security sensitive part of this, and mistakes in implementation on that could certainly undermine this entire process. So we're trusting Duo to handle that for us and use the API. A little bit about why Duo instead of one of their competitors. We evaluated our options, and Duo really has a very flexible API to handle all of the aspects of second factor authentication. So they handle initial enrollment, which is basically the process of a new user registering initially their cell phone or whatever device they want to use as a second factor. Obviously, login time validation, handling of lost devices. This is something that can all be handled through Duo without requiring all of that UI and backend work to be implemented within Sakai itself. As I mentioned before, they have a wide variety of choices for second factor, and that can be set up on a per user basis. So you don't need to make the decision, everyone has to use a hardware token that you're going to supply, or everyone will receive SMS text. Each user can use whichever method is most convenient and available to them. Most people having smartphones, Duo has really nice apps for all of the major smartphone platforms, and we'll take a look in depth more at the user experience here shortly. But that's a really great thing that Duo offers, is the ability for each user to choose their own device and to have multiple devices and use whichever one they have with them or is most convenient at the time. It's also a clean iframe-based hosted web UI. So Duo actually handles all of the user experience and sort of front-end UI work, and just gives you an iframe that you can drop in and communicate with. Again, saving the implementation of that locally. And they offer a free unrestricted account for up to 10 registered users. And given that we're only protecting Sakai administrators in this case, not all of the users of the LMS, 10 users may be enough for some schools if they have 10 or fewer Sakai administrators. And there's a pretty low cost, I think, for the personal account. It's like $1 per user per month or something like that for larger numbers of users. It's also worth noting that Duo is InCommons project's second factor authentication vendor for user ride site licenses. So for example, at our university, we're in the process of rolling out two-factor authentication for everyone who uses our central directory service. And that's going through InCommon, site license, and ultimately through Duo. So if your institution is already looking at implementing this on a much wider scale, it also makes it a good choice to tap into for these purposes. But it's certainly easy to set up a free account. I think they give you 30 days or so of complete unrestricted use, including more than 10 users to try this out. And then you are limited to 10 users or you have to pay after that. So that's kind of how we chose Duo and why we went with them. I want to start off by looking at the user experience, and I just have a sequence of screenshots to kind of show how this works. After we walk through this, we'll dive into detail on the actual implementation. So I'm going to take you through how we implemented this in Sakai, both on the Duo side and on the code changes and implementation details on Sakai side. As well. So to start off, you see the typical login screen for Sakai in step 1 here. We've obviously customized it and branded it a little bit, but this is just the standard out-of-the-box login screen. Remember that based on our implementation, if a user enters a non-administrative credential and hits login, nothing changes. That password will be validated just as it always would, and the user will be logged in. However, if it detects that the account being logged into has administrative credentials, you see a login form similar to what I have here in step 2. The Duo iframe now is appearing right within the login required space on the Sakai side. So again, you still have your portal, and the Duo stuff just replaces the original login form. You can see there that I have a choice of devices and what I can do with those devices to authenticate with my second factor. So this is my cell phone here. I have the option to send me a push, and that will send a push notification via the Duo app that's installed on my phone, and we'll look at that again in a minute. I can get a voice call, which will ask me to basically hit any key to authenticate, or I can enter a passcode that I may have from an SMS text or otherwise. Kind of another view of that second step. Notice in the drop-down box here, I can choose multiple devices. So I have my cell phone and also a desk phone registered. So even dumb devices, just normal desk phones, can do the voice call ability, and you can register those. So if I left my cell phone at home, but I happen to be at my desk, it's easy for me to complete second factor authentication that way. And I also have a hardware token, a YubiKey registered, and that allows me to log in with a USB device. So let's imagine that I chose my cell phone and hit send me a push. In that case, you'll see the screen that I have here in step 3. Then I grab my cell phone and I see an alert on my lock screen that looks like the option here in step 4. I can either respond directly within that, just force touch on the notification and hit approve. I'll be asked for my fingerprint or passcode, and it will send that information back to Duo to let them know that I've approved. I can obviously deny the login if I want, or I can go ahead and enter the notification, open up the Duo app, and see a little bit more information. Here you can see it's just showing my username, IP address, the time of the session. And from there, I can choose to approve or deny that request. If I hit approve, I get what we see here in step 6 and a note at the bottom, success, logging you in. This information comes back from Duo to the iframe displayed there on the Sakai login screen. And then from there, it redirects right into the My Workspace area for the account. And at this point, we're in the same place as we were before the two-factor authentication was installed to where we would have been with just entering the username and password. So it's worth noting that our first factor is that username and password, no change there. You can see the support for multiple devices for each user. And it's really a nice, simple, easy to use interface that is very secure, but also something that doing this on a daily basis is really not a problem. And the workflow takes place entirely within the login frame. There's no pop-up windows. There's no getting redirected to other sites. It all appears very seamless right within the Sakai application. So I'm going to dive into some implementation details now. We'll kind of walk through how to approach this from the initial setup through. I have, obviously, there's a bunch of source code that we won't go through here, but I am going to get into some technical details so that all of you who may be interested in implementing this for yourselves kind of have an idea of how we approach this. And my contact information is on the last slide, and I'd be glad to share some of the code and talk in more detail offline for anyone who really wants to undertake this. So the first step is to set up your Duo account. Go to Duo, get registered. Once you've done that, you'll create one or more Duo applications. And a Duo quote-unquote application is basically a set of shared secrets and integration codes that allows you to make use of their API. Your top-level account will contain all of the users that are registered, for example, your administrative users, but you can have multiple applications to get different shared secrets and integration codes, perhaps for different levels of security within your implementation. So for us, our development server, our QA environment, and production have different Duo applications and different corresponding shared secrets and integration codes, although they all share the same users and we move our database between them from time to time. So it plays very well with the typical 3-tier environment that I know a lot of us use. You need to configure settings, your organization name, logo. You noted on the earlier screens where we were looking at the user experience, our institutional logo is there, and you configure all of that in the web interface for Duo. You set the new user security policy to enrollment mode, and that will allow users who log in with administrative credentials after we get all this set up in Sakai to be prompted by Duo to register their device, so they can kind of do that self-service. And finally, you have to provide Duo the Sakai account usernames that it will be seen. That's the primary way that Duo and Sakai can communicate, and Duo can know which two-factor authentication devices that may be registered are allowed to approve a login for a given user. So this is just the enterprise ID, or the human readable form of the Sakai username as registered in the Sakai database. Let's start sort of with an overview of how to attack this in Sakai. There is some complexity around the way that Sakai handles authentication. Loosely, it validates a username and password and creates a session ID associated with the given user ID once it determines that the username and password provided is valid. What that means is that once you have an administrative session ID, you can do anything regardless of how you obtained it. So there are multiple ways to obtain a session ID. You can get it interactively through the login form, and you can get it through various API calls, the direct session entity provider, the SOAP web services. All of these will give you a long random string session ID. And once you have one from any place, you can use it in any other place. So for example, if I got a session ID from the entity provider, I can set a cookie in my browser and have an interactive login session with that session ID. So the key is to ensure that we protect the ability to obtain an administrative session ID. And unfortunately, Sakai is very inconsistent about exactly the code paths and the methods that are used to generate that session ID and validate credentials in each case. So the SOAP web services do it differently from the login form. There's not a simple, consistent API for validating credentials across all of these. Obviously, security is only as good as your weakest method of creating an administrative session ID. Since once you have that, you can use it wherever you wish. If there's one place that we don't properly protect, we can't prevent anyone from getting a session ID through that weak link and then doing whatever they please with it. It's also poor security practice and sort of an implementation nightmare to hope you can find every possible place in Sakai to get a session ID. As I mentioned, there are several. And sort of rely that you retrofitted each possible method with a check for two-factor authentication. Since the default in Sakai obviously is no concept of two-factor, if you happen to miss one and that the user finds that, they can just log in with the password, bypass two-factor authentication entirely, and get a session ID. It's also worth noting that some login methods may not be used by your institutions at all, or certainly not by your administrative users. In our case, we don't really use the SOAP web services, so that isn't something I was particularly concerned with. And so by figuring out exactly those login methods that you need, you can only allow administrative users to use those particular methods, reduce some of the implementation effort around two-factor, and also reduce the attack service for administrative users. So to that end, we need some libraries to get started. Duo provides official Java libraries to facilitate the usage of their service. It's all hosted on GitHub. It's very well commented, well documented, and like I said, official straight from them. Unfortunately, it's not available in the Maven repositories, so we need to get the libraries and integrate them in Sakai ourselves to be able to use them from elsewhere in the code. There are two main APIs that we're using for this project. They're Web SDK, which handles the interactive logins and includes all of that hosted UI that you saw in the screenshots earlier. As well as the Duo Auth API, which is a lower level way of handling two-factor authentication entirely in code that we're going to be using for more automated scripting type processes and to enable that in a bit. Both libraries are already self-contained, written in Java, relatively easy to add to the Sakai Common project, and then the Maven build system can pull from there to include them elsewhere in Sakai as needed to implement this two-factor authentication. The integration codes and shared secrets that I mentioned earlier that we obtained during account setup ensure that the communication between Sakai and Duo is unforgeable. Obviously, that iframe is passing information to Duo, and the user is free to tinker with that. So hash-based methods authentication signatures are used to sign all of the information coming from Sakai and then back from Duo to ensure that a user who's sort of tampered with that process can't fake an approved response from Duo. These secrets should be stored alongside your database credentials and other sensitive information in Sakai properties. In order to handle the situation that I was describing before, where you have multiple login methods and you don't want to rely on getting every one, and instead want to implement two-factor in only the places that you need, you've got to start way down low in Sakai with the kernel. All of the different higher level APIs and methods used to validate credentials in Sakai boil down to this user directory service authenticate method, which takes the username and password, does a low-level lookup, and returns a success or failure based on the validity of that password as corresponding to the user passed in. So what I did was to modify that method's default implementation to check for super administrator privileges and to fail authentication if the associated account is an administrator, regardless of whether the password is valid or not. What this effectively does is immediately disable administrative login everywhere in Sakai. Then I can add a method override which restores the default behavior and allows login, and then use this new method only in the places where I have retrofitted two-factor authentication and checked the security. Class implementation and interface changes are needed anytime you modify things in kernel and add methods. There's sort of a lot of bubble effect. And higher level login methods also need to be able to sort of bubble down their choice to allow administrative login. So there are a lot of sort of trivial changes that get kind of littered through the code on a result of making these changes. But after these have done, all existing login methods continue to build because I just added a method and changed the way that an existing one works. They'll continue to work as they did before for normal local accounts, but if you provide an administrative credential, they'll return an invalid password error basically, because the high-level method just knows that that user directory service authenticate failed, and it doesn't know why. From there, I can retrofit two-factor authentication into just those login methods that I need to allow administrators to use, and use that method override to re-enable user directory service to authenticate the credentials at that point. So let's start with the interactive login screen. In Sakai, this is where we probably log in the most. It's the workflow that I showed in my screenshots earlier. And again, the first thing is to validate the username and password. It then checks for administrative permissions. Non-admins are directly logged in, but admins receive that two-factor authentication prompt that we saw before. The successful completion of that second factor, for example, responding to the push notification on my phone, will cause Duo to post back to the Sakai login form, and it returns a signed message that says authentication succeeded, gives the username. Sakai then verifies that signature, creates the administrative user session, and logs them in. If the Duo second factor prompt is ignored or declined, nothing happens and no sessions created, and the user is just kind of left on that screen. Non-administrative users never see the Duo form because we checked for administrative permissions as part of that workflow. Once those code changes are made to the login form, when you first log in, you'll see something that looks kind of like this enrollment workflow. And these screenshots were borrowed directly from Duo. Administrative accounts on their first login will see something like you see in step 1 there. They can choose what device to enroll. From there, enter their phone number. It will prompt them to install the app and give them a QR code to scan to get paired up. After they self-service enroll their device the first time, subsequent administrative logins from that user will require that device. I mentioned before that in addition to interactive logins, we needed to handle an ability to sort of get a Sakai session for an administrative user through scripts. And the way that we are doing that now before this project was through the direct session new entity provider. And this provider accepts post data of the username and password, validates it, and returns a session ID if it's valid. In order to enable two-factor authentication for this method, I add an additional parameter, which is a one-time passcode that can be obtained from Duo. When you open the Duo app, in addition to the push notifications that we saw before, you have the ability to tap on the key icon next to the Duo app that you have, or the Duo service that you have in your app, and it will give you a standard 6-digit one-time passcode that changes with the time. And if you provide that to the entity provider, it's able to use the Duo APIs to validate that. And obviously within a programmatic script sense, there's no place for a UI to get a push notification and to do all of that. But it's very simple to just ask for a passcode and then ask Duo via their APIs whether the passcode provided corresponds to the username that you're logging in with. The one-time passcode parameter is ignored and need not exist for non-administrative accounts. Administrative accounts will trigger the validation of that parameter using the auth API that I mentioned before. If the parameter doesn't exist or can't be validated, login will be denied. But if Duo returns that the passcode provided is valid for the username, then the session ID for that administrative user will be provided by the entity broker. As I mentioned, the easiest way to get that passcode from Duo once you're enrolled is to open the app on your phone, but you can also ask Duo to send you a text message with a series of codes to use, or you can obtain one from a Duo high-level administrator who has access to the initial account setup from the earlier steps, and they can provide kind of a one-time use code that way. So to kind of wrap up here, two-factor authentication greatly strengthens the security of Sakai administrative accounts. At this point, if a password is phished, it's not going to do the user any good because they aren't going to have the ability to authenticate that second factor. Duo is a really great service that's inexpensive and secure and gives a lot of flexibility. With the changes in Sakai 11 to allow Sakai administrator to change to another user, to become a user and then log out and get back to their administrative account and then repeat that process. This is really a low impact thing. At the beginning of your work, you log in, you complete two-factor authentication, you get your administrative session in Sakai, and then you can go about your business. The code changes to implement are moderate in difficulty. The Duo APIs make it pretty easy. There's still some heavy lifting and kernel changes and all required to handle the fact that the Sakai code is kind of spidery and you don't have a single place to implement two-factor, but instead you kind of have to attack it each place that an administrative user may need to log in. But fortunately, you can allow admin logins via as few or as many methods as you need. So for example, if your institution uses the SOAP web services a lot, the approach that I took to implementing two-factor auth in the entity provider is applicable there. And we just didn't do that because we don't use those services, but the same approach can be taken for whichever methods you may need. So at this point, I'll open it up for questions. So Derek, I don't know how we handle that.
They can either unmute if they're muted and speak, or they can type it in the chat, so we'll keep the eye open. Chat.
All right. I see one question from Matthew. Are you using Duo across your whole institution or just for Sakai? So the answer is yes, in a sense. We implemented this for Sakai before the entire institution, although our security team is in the process of rolling it out for the entire institution. So right now, our Duo implementation and our institutional-wide Duo implementation are different, although we have plans to merge them and take advantage of the single site license going forward. But the initial setup that you saw here was specific to Sakai. Any other questions? Yeah, the questions are in chat for anyone following along. It gets us thinking about admin login security too, and really when I started to think about all that an administrative accountant in Sakai could do, we really accelerated the timetable for this project because there's a ton of very sensitive protected data and it's a big target, and so it makes sense to treat it as such and protect it heavily. Any implementation questions or anything else that I may have skipped over or missed or gone too quick on before that anybody wonders? How long are your Sakai sessions valid for? 2 hours. Yes, 2 hours of inactivity. All right, anybody else with thoughts or questions? All right. Oh wait. Do you think current Sakai login security is enough, or should we be concerned when only using local Sakai users? Are you referring to for all users or for admin accounts? I'm not sure I understand the question. Okay. Yeah, I mean, for normal users, I certainly don't believe that there are any weaknesses in the Sakai implementation of username and password verification. But the issue is sort of the target, right? So just as any service that only uses a username and password is easier to hack into than something that's locked down in some way, be that with a second factor or from a particular network requiring a VPN. You know, there's a lot of ways to limit access to accounts besides username and password. I think that in general, for normal users, obviously the status quo seems to be okay. But our real concern was the fact that administrative accounts are exponentially more valuable than your average account in Sakai. Does Duo allow a trust this computer from now on? The answer is yes if you pay extra. So for organizations with the full site license, that's included. You can also, on an individual basis, choose to pay more for additional features, and the ability to remember a device for a certain number of days is something that they offer easily within their workflow. But it doesn't come with the base account. You have to upgrade to a higher tier for that. So once we sync up with our institutional-wide site license, that's something we'll certainly. All right. Well, my contact information is on the last slide here. I also posted a copy of these slides on the conference site for anyone who would like to review them. So feel free to reach out to me if you have additional questions. We have a pretty heavily customized version of Sakai, but I'm certainly willing to share the code changes that we made for this with someone who's really looking at implementing this. So if this is something that's of interest to people, feel free to reach out to me by email there.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, for the presentation. Go ahead and stop recording.